Can you explain why Electro and Bloom Teams helps core generation compared to Pyro? Sure. Let's open Paint. How does the Bloom reaction work? Bloom has a forward side and a reverse side, right? Just like Vape and Melt. Unlike Vape and Melt, though, there is no reason ever to do the forward side. For Vape and Melt, right, the forward side has its damage multiplied by 2, and the reverse side has its damage multiplied by 1.5. In exchange for the lower multiplier, though, the reverse side reaction consumes less aura. Basically, if you throw fire at ice, the ice melts instantly, but if you throw ice at water, if you throw ice at fire, it's not enough to put out the fire by itself. You need to throw a fuck ton of ice. Right? Analogy? It's not even an analogy. It's the beauty of the Genshin's elemental system, is that it actually just makes sense. If you throw a bunch of ice cubes at if you throw a bunch of ice cubes at fire, it doesn't instantly put out the fire, because the ice has to melt before it becomes the water that is going to deprive the fire of its oxygen source. So it takes a bunch of ice to put out fire. But fire melts ice very quickly. No problem. Same for vaporize. If you throw a bucket of water onto a fire, fire's gone. But if you're trying to boil water, it takes a while. Right? So the forward side and the reverse side, they make sense. For Bloom, there's a similar thing. There's a forward side and a reverse side. It doesn't change the reaction itself, but it does change how the auras get consumed. Right? So for Melt, if you have a cryo aura, if you have some ice cubes, right? You have a cryo aura on enemy. Let's say you have a 1 unit cryo aura. So how should we mark 1 unit? Maybe just 1 dot of this, right? You have a 1 unit of cryo. Actually, this is ugly as fuck. Can we do it with a pen? This is too small. And we can't zoom in any more than this. Fuck. What if I just do this? Nah, that's too annoying. Fine, I'll just do the brush. Whatever. Right, so you have 1 unit of cryo. If you apply Pyro onto it, pretty much no matter how much Pyro you apply, your cryo's gone. Right? But that's still the case if you have 2 units of cryo. Right? The way that it works in the background is each 1 unit of Pyro can melt 2 units of cryo. Right? So when you have your fucking hilly churl, right? You have your hilly churl, okay? And you apply 2 units of cryo onto him. 1 unit of Pyro is enough to wipe this out completely. On the other hand, if you have 1 unit of Pyro, for the reverse side reaction, it's the other way around. Instead of being multiplied by 2, it's divided by 2. So 1 unit of cryo isn't actually enough to fully remove, right? If you add 1 unit of cryo, effectively, you just end up losing half of your Pyro. And you need to add a 2nd unit of cryo to remove what's left. But in exchange for that, right? Right, like you get to trigger 2 reactions from your application, but in exchange for that, it does more damage. Alright, sorry, it does less damage. For Bloom, there's a similar mechanic, right? You've got your Hydro Aura or your Dendro Aura, and you either have a Dendro trigger or a Hydro trigger. Good way to remember it is it takes a fuck ton of water to make a plant grow. But it only takes a little bit of dirt to muddy the waters. Okay? So, if you have a Hydro Aura, even just a little bit of Dendro is going to be enough to wipe it. Right? So, your 1 unit of Dendro is enough to remove 2 units of Hydro. But the other way around, if the enemy has a Dendro Aura, it allows for you to trigger, or to trigger 2 Hydro reactions, because the first Hydro is divided by 2, so you only remove half, and then you need a second Hydro to remove the rest. 3 with Nahida. Well, Nahida, what she does is she applies 1.5 units of Dendro, which allows you to get your first one, your second one, and your third one. So you can get up to 3 reactions instead of 2. Anyways, that's the default way that these reactions work. In other words, if you get to decide exactly when things happen, the highest amount of blooms you'll be able to trigger will happen if you have a Dendro Aura rather than a Hydro Aura. Because if you have a Hydro Aura, in order to trigger a bloom, you need Hydro, 1, Dendro, 1, that wipes your aura, you get 1 bloom core out of it. Right? So if you Hydro plus Dendro, it's 1 bloom. If you do the other way around and you do Dendro Aura first, you get Dendro plus Hydro, and that gets you a bloom, but you still have enough Dendro left to get another bloom. So Dendro plus 2 Hydro equal 2 blooms. So same amount of Dendro, 1 more Hydro, double the blooms. In other words, each bloom, instead of requiring 1 Dendro, 1 Hydro, requires one Hydro, half a Dendro. In other words, if you can maintain a Dendro Aura on enemies, your upper limit for the amount of blooms you can trigger will be higher. This is why, in Nilo teams, you generally want to build full EM on your Hydro character, more so than on your Dendro ones. That's how it works for baseline bloom. But once you start adding additional elements, things can change a little bit. So, let's talk about that. If you have a bunch of Electro, what exactly happens? So, if there's a Dendro Aura, and you apply Electro on it, what happens? You trigger Quicken. Let me get an additional color for Quicken, right? It wipes the Dendro, and it gives you a Quicken Aura instead. This Quicken Aura is just a Dendro Aura in disguise. In other words, if you then apply Hydro, it does the exact same thing. It wipes away half to get you a bloom, and then another Hydro wipes away half to get you a bloom. Right? In other words, if you end up with a Dendro Aura, your Electro application doesn't really change anything. You still get 1 bloom per Hydro plus half Dendro. 1 bloom still requires 1 Hydro app plus 1 Dendro plus half a Dendro app. However, if instead of a Dendro Aura you have a Hydro Aura, things are different. So what happens if you have a Hydro Aura and you apply Electro? Well, things get a little weird, because you trigger Electro Charge, or with Inefo, Lunar Charge, but they work the same way, so it's fine. How does Electro Charge work? It's gonna make it so that both auras are gonna exist on the enemy at the same time. And it'll also make it so that the enemies take Electro Charge damage every second-ish, which consumes a bit of the aura for both of them. Let's put them real close together and make it so that we just do bam. Right? Electro Charge consumes a little bit from both of them. But as long as you have fairly fast application of both Hydro and Electro, the auras with Electro Charge pretty much always stay either like this or like this. What happens if you apply Dendro onto an Electro Charge aura? So, you apply Dendro. Dendro sees the Electro aura first. Because of aura attacks, which is something I haven't explained yet, but it's very straightforward. Anytime you apply an element, if you apply 1U onto an enemy, the enemy doesn't get the full 1U, it gets 0.8, right? So 20% of the aura gets taxed when you try to apply it onto something. Basically, right, when you throw some water at someone, some of the water drips onto the ground. It doesn't all stay on the enemy, right? But at the moment it's thrown, it is all on the enemy. So the tax only happens for the aura that stays on the enemy, not for the trigger. Anyways, what that means is that you're always with an Electro aura that is somewhere between 0.3 and 0. Or like 0.2 and 0.8 units, but it's never at 1 or higher. It's always below that. So if you apply 1 unit of Dendro onto less than 1 unit of Electro, what happens? You trigger a quicken. Okay, you get a quicken aura. But when you have simultaneous auras on an enemy, and you apply an element that can react with both, something interesting happens. Usually, if you apply too much trigger onto an aura, shit just disappears, right? If you apply a, 2U Pyro onto a really weak Cryo aura, it melts, but you don't, the additional leftover Pyro doesn't stay anywhere. It's just gone, right? But when there's a second aura on an enemy, things are different. That leftover aura, instead of disappearing into the void, is going to try to react with the rest of the aura. It's going to try to react on the other element once there's no more Electro to be reacted with, right? So, once your Dendro... So your Dendro reacts with the Electro, it consumes all of the Electro, and in order to consume all of the Electro, it loses a little bit of itself, but there's still a little bit of Dendro left over. And that leftover Dendro looks at the Hydro. Dendro on Hydro triggers Bloom. And so, you end up with a Bloom core. But on top of this Bloom core, you also have a Quicken aura on the enemy. Right? Because when you applied Dendro onto Electro Charge, you triggered Quicken before you triggered Bloom. And so you get Quicken and Bloom. But this Quicken aura, like I said earlier, works like a Dendro aura. In other words, the Quicken aura, if you have a lot more Hydro, can get you a second Bloom as well. And so when you have Electro Charge in the mix for a Bloom team, even if there's a Hydro aura, as long as there's also an Electro aura on the enemy, you will still end up with this same formula, right? When you have an Electro aura, let's make this lighter and have it be a background. Right? The second one stays the same, right? If you Hydro onto Dendro or Hydro onto Quicken, it stays the same. But if you Dendro onto Hydro, it gets you a Bloom Seed, or sorry, it gets you a Bloom, but it also gets you a Quicken, or actually it's like half a Quicken, and this half Quicken can be reacted with a Hydro to get you an additional Bloom. In other words, you get one more Hydro for one more Bloom. And so, all of this to say, that constant Electro Aura makes it so that instead of you needing to have a consistent trigger and a consistent aura in order to maximize your blooms per Dendro application, now it doesn't matter. Whether you have a Hydro Aura or a Dendro Aura, you will always get an upper limit of 2 Hydro or 2 blooms per Dendro. This is why Hyper Bloom is so much better than Burgeon. It's part of why. Let's talk about the other reason why Hyper Bloom is better than Burgeon. So, let's look at the same scenario with some Pyro application in the mix. What happens when you apply Pyro onto Hydro? What happens when you try to boil some water? It takes a lot of heat to boil the water, and so 1 unit of Pyro isn't enough to wipe out the Hydro. You still have a little bit of Hydro left. Then, when you apply Dendro onto that leftover Hydro, it wipes what's left, and it gives you a Bloom Seed. So Dendro onto Hydro is still 1 Bloom. So for that side, there's no problem. However, what happens when you trigger, or when you have a Dendro Aura? So, you have a Dendro Aura on the enemy. You apply Pyro onto this. You now have a Burning Aura. The Burning Aura is effectively a coexisting Dendro and Pyro Aura. Make it orange? Sure. That's a good idea. I like that. The Burning Aura has a property that pretty much nothing else has. Kinda. Technically, other things have it, but Burning does tax evasion. Burning is a criminal, okay? The IRS is going after Burning. Burning is set at a 2U aura that evades taxes and does not decay. In other words, it is permanently a 2U aura unless you react with it. But here's the thing about 2U Pyro. When you apply Hydro, we've already said Hydro onto Pyro, it's the forward reaction, right? It's easy for water to put out a fire. But it's just ×2. And so if you apply 1 unit of Hydro ×2, that's 2. And this Burning Aura dodges taxes and doesn't decay, which means it is also 2. So if you apply 2 on an aura that's exactly 2, you will wipe the full thing, but it will require all of your Hydro, and you won't have any leftover Hydro to react with the Dendro Aura you have. In other words, you get a vape, but you don't get a bloom. Which means you need a second Hydro to get your first bloom, and a third one to get your second bloom. But that's not all. While Burning is on the enemy, sure, the Burning Aura doesn't decay, but you know what does decay? The Dendro Aura. And it decays real fucking fast. This wood that you have on the enemy is currently in the process of being burned. As the wood is burning, the heat stays the same, right? The Burning Aura doesn't decay, but the amount of wood you have left goes down, and it goes down quickly. In other words, if the burning stays on the enemy for a little bit too long, you can actually eat more than half of your Dendro. And if you do, once you apply Hydro, you wipe the burning, and then another hydro, that'll wipe all you have left. And so, you end up with each Pyro app basically preventing you from getting a Hydro app to trigger a Bloom, and also potentially making you lose Dendro app as well. So, when you're under a burning aura, or when you've got some burning, right? If you end up with a Hydro aura and apply Dendro on it, you still get your 1 seed, which is the default baseline with no external auras. But if you Dendro onto Hydro, you can technically get up to 2. That's only 1. But technically you can also get up to 3, right? To get you a second one. But that second one only happens if your burning wasn't on the enemy for too long, so really it's more like 1.5. In other words, with burning, or with Pyro for burgeon, you need much, much higher Hydro application in order not to lose blooms from the default. And you'll never gain blooms. Whereas with Hyper Bloom, you never lose blooms, and you pretty much always gain a bunch too. The trade-off here is that the byproduct reactions, Electro Charged and Quicken, are much worse than Vaporize is for like the upper limit of what that can provide for your team. That's the way it's balanced. Hyper Bloom, by default, is much better than Burgeon, but the byproduct reactions of Hyper Bloom provide less for your team than the byproduct reactions of Burgeon. Anyways, in a Raiden Hyper Bloom team, as much as Raiden's skill hits enemies pretty much every second, it has standard ICD, so it only applies Electro every 3 seconds. That means that with really fast Hydro, right? If you have Dendro Aura, you'll only get that additional seed that we got here if it lines up with Raiden's Electro application. And if it doesn't, then you'll just get the default one that you have. The nice thing about Llama and Inefa is that they both have the exact same trigger interval. Both of them apply their elements exactly every 2 seconds. So if you set them up properly, you can guarantee that you always have the Electro Aura right before the Dendro Aura. How would you design a character for Burgeon? I've talked about this before, but I think that the main thing that Burgeon is missing right now is proper Hydro units for it. Because like I've said, right, Burgeon by design inherently allows you to get less cores. But the trade-off is that the byproduct reaction is better. In other words, I think that a Burgeon carry should be a character that is played in teams where the Vaporize matters. In order for that to happen, what you would need to have, right, is, right, you have your Burning Aura with a Dendro. You would need to have a character that applies more than 1 U Hydro when they hit. Because you don't want to apply 1 U Hydro twice, because then one of them is going to vape and the other one isn't, right? Sure, you'll get a vape and a bloom, but only one of the attacks is going to vape. What you want is something that hits for 1.5 or 2 U Hydro, so that there is going to be leftover when it's multiplied by 2 and compared to the 2-unit burning. That way your attack can both trigger Vaporize and Bloom. When I did my fan-made Farina kit long before Fontaine came out for April Fools, that's what I did, right? I designed a character that had fairly slow more than 1 U Hydro application, but no weapon infusion, so you could play them with C6 Bennett. In order to make them a character that wanted to both Vaporize and Burgeon. Yeah, it's kind of what I wish we got from Milani, but it is what it is. It is what it is. Coordinated attacks with it doesn't need to be 3U. It just needs to be more than 1. It can be 1.000001 and it'll be enough. Because the Burning Aura is exactly 2. So as long as when you multiply the Hydro Aura by the Hydro Trigger by 2, it's larger than 2, it'll be enough. And if it's 1.00001, it'll be the same as 1U for literally everything except burning. Alright, and technically the way that it's coded, it's not in units. It's in, like, gauge. And the units for gauge are not multiples of 1, right? It's not 1 unit, 2 units, whatever. It's 30. Like, one gauge unit is 30 gauge. And that's how it works in the background of the game. So they could very well make a unit that has 31 gauge on their application.